Eleanor Whitmore's hand froze on the door handle when she heard her fiancé's voice inside the drawing room, low and warm, speaking words that were never meant for her. She had come early. The contract signing was set for noon, and she wanted a quiet moment with Edmund Halsey before both families gathered to make their engagement official. Instead, she heard laughter, soft and familiar, and beneath it, another voice she knew even better than her own. Charlotte Vane. Eleanor did not move. She told herself there was an explanation, that her best friend since childhood would never sit so close to her intended, that the warmth in Edmund's voice was nothing more than politeness. She pushed the door open anyway, because some part of her already understood what she would find, and some stubborn, foolish part of her needed to see it with her own eyes before she could believe it. Edmund's hand rested over Charlotte's on the settee. Charlotte's cheeks were flushed pink, her lips curved in the small, private smile Eleanor had seen 100 times before, though never directed at another woman's betrothed. Neither of them noticed her at first. For 3 full seconds, Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the two people she trusted most in the world share a moment that had nothing to do with her. Then Edmund looked up. His face did not fall the way a guilty man's should. He did not leap to his feet or stammer an apology. He simply looked at her, calm and almost pitying, as though she were the one intruding on something that belonged to him. "Eleanor," he said, "you were not meant to arrive until noon." As if the hour was the problem. As if, had she simply been later, none of this would have needed explaining. Charlotte at least had the decency to pull her hand away, though the movement came a beat too slow, and her eyes darted to Edmund before they found Eleanor, seeking guidance rather than offering apology. That single glance told Eleanor more than any confession could have. Charlotte was not sorry to have been caught with him. She was only sorry to have been caught before she was ready. "How long?" Eleanor asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her chest felt as though it had been hollowed out with a blade. "How long has this been happening?" Edmund rose from the settee and smoothed the front of his coat, buying himself time the way he always did before delivering news he knew would not be welcomed. "It is not what you believe. Then tell me what it is." He did not answer right away, and in his silence Eleanor found the truth more clearly than any words could have given it to her. She turned to Charlotte, who had risen as well and now stood twisting her fingers together, refusing to meet Eleanor's eyes. "Charlotte, look at me." Charlotte lifted her chin, and for one moment something like shame flickered across her face, but it passed quickly, replaced by a kind of defiance that Eleanor had never seen in her before, not in 15 years of friendship, not through every secret they had ever kept for each other. "I did not plan for this to happen," Charlotte said, "but I will not apologize for how I feel." The words landed like a slap. Eleanor had expected denial, or excuses, or even tears. She had not expected her closest friend to stand before her and refuse remorse, as though love, once discovered, erased every promise that had come before it. Eleanor might have said something more. She might have asked how long they had been meeting behind her back, how many dinners and walks and quiet afternoons had been stolen from her without her knowledge. But the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel outside cut through the moment, and she realized with a cold drop in her stomach that the hour had come. The families were arriving. In minutes, this room would fill with witnesses to whatever happened next. She had 2 choices. She could flee before anyone arrived and spare herself the humiliation of being seen, or she could stay and let the truth be known before Edmund and Charlotte had the chance to shape it into something more forgiving of themselves. Eleanor chose to stay. Her father entered first, his face bright with the particular pride of a man about to see his daughter well settled. Behind him came Edmund's parents, then Charlotte's mother, then a handful of family friends who had been invited to witness the signing. The room, so quiet moments before, filled quickly with the rustle of fine clothing and polite greetings, and no one yet understood that the ceremony they had come to see would not take place. "Eleanor," her father said, beaming, "you look pale, my dear. Are you unwell?" "I am quite well, father." She kept her eyes on Edmund as she spoke, daring him to be the one to explain himself, to spare her the burden of telling the story in front of everyone who mattered. He said nothing. He only looked at the floor, and in his silence, Eleanor understood that he intended to let her carry the weight of this moment alone, exactly as he had let her walk into that drawing room without warning. So she told them herself. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing exactly what she had seen, and exactly how long she had stood in the doorway before either of them noticed her. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply laid the truth before the room the way one might lay out evidence in a court, calm and precise, because she understood that hysteria would only give Edmund and Charlotte a way to paint her as unreasonable, while composure would leave them nowhere to hide. The room fell into stunned silence. Her father's face drained of color. Edmund's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Charlotte's mother turned to her daughter with an expression of pure horror, as though seeing her for the first time. "Is this true?" Eleanor's father asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Edmund would not meet his eyes. Edmund straightened his shoulders, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the practiced calm of a man who had already decided how this would end. "Eleanor and I are no longer suited," he said. "I believe Charlotte and I understand each other far better." The cruelty of it was not in the words themselves, but in how easily he said them, as though breaking a contract and humiliating a woman in front of both their families cost him nothing at all. Eleanor felt something inside her go very still and very cold. She had loved this man. She had trusted this friend. And here they stood, together, choosing each other over her in front of everyone she had ever known. Her father tried to intervene, his voice rising with anger as he demanded an explanation, a correction, some way to salvage what remained of the arrangement. But there was no salvaging it. Everyone in that room had heard enough to understand exactly what had happened, and no amount of protest would undo it. Eleanor did not stay to watch the argument unfold. She turned and walked out of the drawing room, down the hall, and out through the front doors into the cold morning air, leaving behind the sound of raised voices and her father calling her name. She did not run. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her run. She simply walked, steady and unhurried, until the house was far behind her, and the only sound left was her own breathing. By evening, the story had already begun to travel. Servants talked to other servants. Carriages carried news from one house to the next faster than any letter could. By the time Eleanor sat alone in her room that night, staring at an unlit candle rather than calling for someone to light it, she understood that her old life was already over. There would be no quiet way to recover from this. Every household she had ever visited would know her name now, not as the woman who was to marry Edmund Halsey, but as the woman her best friend had stolen him from. She thought about weeping. She thought about screaming into her pillow the way she imagined other women might, women who had less pride or more patience for their own grief. Instead, she sat very still in the dark and made herself a promise. She would not spend the rest of her life being spoken of with pity. She did not yet know how she would rebuild what had been taken from her, but she knew she would not do it by begging for sympathy or waiting for Edmund and Charlotte to feel the shame that rightfully belonged to them. Her father came to her door once, his voice gentle through the wood, asking if she wished to talk. She told him she needed rest, and after a moment his footsteps retreated down the hall. She was grateful for his concern, but there was nothing left to say that the day had not already said for her. Late into the night, long after the house had gone quiet, Eleanor rose and packed a single trunk. She did not know yet where she would go, only that she could not remain in a house so close to the Halsey estate, could not risk passing Charlotte in the village square, or hearing her name spoken with laughter at some future gathering. She had an aunt in a quieter part of the county, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her disinterest in society gossip, and Eleanor decided before dawn that this was where she would go. She left before the sun rose, taking only what she could carry and a small amount of money her mother had left her years before. She did not say goodbye to anyone but her father, and even that was only a short note left on the table, promising she was safe and asking him not to follow. As the carriage carried her away from everything she had known, Eleanor watched the familiar hills disappear behind her and felt, beneath the grief and the anger, something else beginning to take shape. She did not yet know what it was, but it felt, faintly, like the first outline of a woman deciding to become someone new. She thought of Charlotte often during that ride, though she tried not to. 15 years of shared secrets did not vanish simply because one betrayal outweighed them all. She remembered summers spent reading together beneath the old oak behind her father's house, the letters they had exchanged when Charlotte's family traveled abroad, the promises made as girls that nothing would ever come between them. She had believed those promises the way children believe the sky will always be blue. She understood now how little such promises were worth once real desire entered the picture. She thought less of Edmund, strangely. His betrayal hurt in a different way, sharper but somehow less personal. He had wanted something, and he had taken it, the way men of his standing often did without much thought for the cost to anyone else. It was Charlotte's choice that lingered longest in her mind, because it had required a kind of daily deception that a stranger's selfishness never could. By the time the carriage reached the edge of the county, Eleanor had stopped crying altogether. Her eyes were dry, her spine straight, and though her heart still ached with the raw freshness of the morning's wound, she found she could look out at the passing fields without flinching. She did not know what waited for her at her aunt's house, or what kind of life she might build with the pieces that remained. She only knew that she would not spend it waiting for an apology that would never come. The bidding had already begun by the time Eleanor slipped into the back of the crowded hall, her shawl drawn tight against the chill of the stone walls. 6 weeks had passed since she arrived at her Aunt Margaret's house, 6 weeks of quiet mornings and long walks and the slow, difficult work of learning to be someone whose name no longer carried an engagement attached to it. She had not planned to attend the charity auction that evening. It was her aunt who insisted, declaring that a woman who hid from every gathering only fed the rumors that already circled her like crows. "Let them see you standing," Aunt Margaret had said, fastening a simple string of pearls around Eleanor's neck. "A woman who hides looks guilty of something. A woman who appears looks as though she has nothing to hide at all." Eleanor had not entirely believed her aunt's logic, but she lacked the will to argue, and so she found herself standing near the back of a crowded assembly hall, watching strangers bid on items donated for the benefit of a local hospital, while whispers about her own recent misfortune drifted through the room like smoke that never quite cleared. She recognized a few faces from her old life, women who had once called on her regularly, and now offered only stiff nods from across the hall. She did not blame them entirely. Scandal made people cautious, afraid that association might stain them by proximity. She had expected as much, and she told herself she had come only to prove her aunt's point, not to seek anyone's approval. It was during the bidding for a small landscape painting, one nobody seemed particularly eager to claim, that she first noticed him. He stood near the front of the hall, tall and unmoving amid the shifting crowd, dressed in dark, unadorned clothing that somehow drew more attention than the brightest coat in the room. She did not know his name at first, only that people seemed to give him a wide berth, the way one might avoid standing too close to a fire that burned hotter than it appeared. When the auctioneer called for bids on the painting and the room fell silent, he raised 2 fingers without looking up, and the bidding ended almost as quickly as it began. "That is the Duke of Ashcombe," a woman beside Eleanor whispered to her companion, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "Nathaniel Graves. They say he has not attended a social function in over a year." Eleanor had heard the name before, the way one hears the names of mountains or rivers, distant things that shape the landscape without ever needing to be visited. The Duke of Ashcombe was known throughout the county for his success in trade and shipping, for the ruthless efficiency with which he managed his estates, and for a coldness toward society that had earned him both respect and a certain wary distance. He was not a man people spoke of warmly. He was a man people spoke of carefully. She thought nothing more of him, until the auction ended and the crowd began to disperse into smaller clusters, moving toward refreshments laid out along the far wall. Eleanor, uninterested in mingling, had turned toward a quieter corner of the hall when she found herself unexpectedly in his path. "You did not bid on anything," he said, without preamble, as though they were already mid-conversation. Eleanor blinked, startled that he had addressed her at all. "I did not come to buy paintings, Your Grace. Few people do. Most come to be seen buying them." He studied her for a moment, his gaze neither warm nor unkind, simply direct in a way she was not accustomed to. "You are Eleanor Whitmore." It was not a question, and she felt her spine stiffen at the mention of her name, bracing for whatever unkind remark might follow, the sort of comment she had grown used to receiving in the weeks since the broken engagement became common knowledge. "I am. I heard what happened." He said it plainly, without the false sympathy or thinly veiled curiosity she had come to expect from nearly everyone else who raised the subject. Most women in your position would have left the room before the truth came out. "You stayed and spoke it yourself." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond to an observation so unlike the pity she usually received. "I did not see the use in pretending otherwise. The truth would have found its way out regardless. I preferred it come from me." Something shifted in his expression, so slight she nearly missed it, a flicker of interest where she expected only cool detachment. "That is a rare instinct," he said. "Most people, when caught in humiliation, choose to hide, rather than to speak plainly. Perhaps I had less to lose by speaking than by staying silent. Perhaps." He inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to a bow he seemed inclined to offer. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." He turned and walked away before she could form a reply, leaving her standing alone near the refreshment table with the distinct sense that she had just passed some manner of test without knowing the questions being asked. She watched him move through the crowd, other guests parting for him the way water parts for a ship's hull, none of them attempting conversation, none of them lingering near him longer than courtesy required. Her aunt found her a few minutes later, eyebrows raised with unmistakable curiosity. "Was that the Duke of Ashcombe speaking with you?" "It was." He does not speak with anyone. I have attended a dozen events where he stood in a corner the entire evening without exchanging a single word beyond what politeness demanded. Margaret studied her niece with new interest. What did he say to you? Very little, Eleanor admitted. He mentioned that he had heard about Edmund. And nothing. He did not offer sympathy. He simply observed that I had chosen to speak the truth rather than hide from it. She frowned slightly, still turning the brief exchange over in her mind. It was strange. Most people either avoid the subject entirely or linger on it far too long, as though my misfortune were the most interesting thing to happen in the county this year. He did neither. Margaret said nothing further on the matter that evening, though Eleanor noticed her aunt glancing toward the Duke more than once before the night ended, as though reassessing something she had long assumed settled. The following days brought no further contact, and Eleanor told herself she had not expected any. A man of his standing did not concern himself with a woman whose engagement had recently collapsed in front of half the county, however briefly interesting the conversation might have seemed. She returned to the quiet rhythm of her days at her aunt's house, tending the small garden behind the cottage, reading in the mornings, and trying not to think too often of Edmund or Charlotte, though their names still found their way into her thoughts more frequently than she wished. It was nearly 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon when rain threatened but never quite fell, that a letter arrived bearing a seal Eleanor did not immediately recognize. She turned it over twice before opening it, and when she finally read the contents, she found herself sitting very still at the kitchen table, the paper held loosely in her hands. The letter was brief, written in a hand as direct as its author's manner of speaking. The Duke of Ashcombe requested the pleasure of her company at a dinner intended to discuss a matter of mutual benefit, one he believed she would find worth her consideration. He gave no further details, only a date, a time, and the assurance that her aunt was welcome to accompany her if she wished for the arrangement to appear proper. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before she fully absorbed its meaning. She had expected, if anything further ever came from their brief exchange at the auction, some polite inquiry after her well-being, or perhaps nothing at all. She had not expected an invitation framed as a matter of business, delivered with the same blunt efficiency the Duke seemed to apply to everything else in his life. "What is it?" Aunt Margaret asked, noticing the stillness that had settled over her niece. Eleanor handed over the letter without a word, and watched her aunt's eyebrows climb steadily higher as she read. "A matter of mutual benefit," Margaret repeated slowly, setting the letter down. "Whatever could a man like that want from you?" "I have no idea," Eleanor admitted, "but I intend to find out." She spent the following days turning the invitation over in her mind, trying to imagine what business a man of the Duke's wealth and standing might possibly have with a woman whose only recent claim to notice was the public collapse of her engagement. Part of her wondered if this was some manner of cruelty in disguise, an elaborate joke at her expense dressed up as opportunity. But she could not reconcile that suspicion with the man she had briefly spoken to at the auction, whose directness had seemed entirely free of mockery. In the days before the dinner, Eleanor found herself thinking more carefully about the man she had agreed to meet than she cared to admit. She asked her aunt what else was known of him, and Margaret, who prided herself on knowing the shape of every prominent family in the county, even when she claimed no interest in gossip, offered what little she had gathered over the years. The Duke had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden death left the estate in disorder, and its finances in worse condition than anyone outside the family fully understood. Rather than lean on advisors or marry quickly into wealth, as many in his position might have done, he had spent nearly a decade rebuilding the estate through shipping ventures and careful investment, methods some considered beneath a man of his rank, and others quietly admired for their success. He had, in the process, developed a reputation for being difficult to read, slow to trust, and entirely uninterested in the courtship rituals that consumed most of society's attention. No scandal attached itself to his name, which in itself was unusual for a man so wealthy and so watched. He simply worked, and avoided company, and let the rest of the county speculate as it pleased. "Some say he intends never to marry at all," Margaret said, settling into her chair by the fire. "Others say he is simply waiting for a woman sensible enough not to bore him within a fortnight. I could not tell you which is closer to the truth." "And you believe I am being invited to discuss marriage?" Eleanor asked, startled by the implication. "I believe nothing yet," her aunt replied. "But a man like that does not extend invitations lightly, and he certainly does not need to seek out a woman recently disgraced in society for any ordinary matter of business. Whatever he wants, Eleanor, it is not ordinary." The observation stayed with Eleanor long after the conversation ended. She found herself, in quiet moments over the following days, imagining what possible arrangement could interest a man of such standing. She was no great heiress. Her family's fortune, while respectable, was nothing compared to what the Duke commanded. She had no particular skill in trade or politics that might make her useful to him in the way an advisor or business partner might be useful. The only thing she possessed that seemed at all remarkable was the very thing that had ruined her socially, a willingness to speak plainly, even when the truth cost her dearly. Perhaps, she thought one evening while walking the narrow garden path behind her aunt's cottage, that was precisely what interested him. A man surrounded by flattery and careful maneuvering might value honesty simply because it was so rarely offered to him without some hidden motive attached. She also found herself recalling small details from their brief exchange at the auction, the way he had studied her, without the practiced charm most gentlemen employed when speaking to a woman, the directness of his questions, the total absence of pity in his voice when he mentioned Edmund's betrayal. Most people who raised the subject did so either to extract details for their own amusement or to offer sympathy so thick it curdled into condescension. He had done neither. He had simply stated a fact and moved past it, as though her humiliation were not the most interesting thing about her, only one detail among many. It was a small thing, perhaps, but after weeks of being treated as though her broken engagement defined her entirely, the memory of being seen as something more had lodged itself firmly in her mind. She dressed carefully for the evening, choosing a gown of deep blue that her aunt insisted suited her far better than the pale colors fashion currently favored. Standing before the small mirror in her room, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The girl who had once dreamed of a simple, happy marriage to Edmund Halsey seemed a stranger now, replaced by someone steadier, someone who had learned in a very short time how quickly comfort could be stripped away, and how much strength it took to stand upright afterward. Aunt Margaret offered to accompany her, as the letter had suggested, but Eleanor found herself declining at the last moment, deciding instead that whatever conversation awaited her should happen without an audience, even a friendly one. She wanted to face the Duke on her own terms, without her aunt's watchful presence shaping how she responded to whatever he proposed. As the carriage that had been sent for her rolled up the long drive toward Ashcombe House that evening, Eleanor felt none of the nervous excitement she might once have felt approaching a suitor's home. Instead, she felt a strange, steady calm, the kind that came from having already survived the worst things she could imagine happening to her. Whatever the Duke wanted, she told herself, it could hardly humiliate her more than she had already been humiliated. There was a certain freedom in that thought, one she had not expected to find so soon after everything had fallen apart. By the time the appointed evening arrived, Eleanor had decided that whatever the Duke intended, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else since that terrible morning in the drawing room, directly, and without apology for who she had become. The Duke did not speak of marriage that evening, though the dinner lasted nearly 2 hours and covered more ground than Eleanor had expected any single conversation could. He received her in a study lined with maps and shipping ledgers rather than a formal parlor, an arrangement that told her something about the man before he had spoken a single word. There was no attempt at romance in the setting, no soft candlelight or careful staging meant to charm. There was only a long table set simply for two, and the Duke himself standing near the window, watching the last light fade over his grounds. "Miss Whitmore," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. "Thank you for coming." She sat, arranging her skirts with more composure than she felt, and waited for him to explain the purpose behind the invitation. He did not make her wait long. "I understand that your circumstances have changed considerably in recent weeks," he began, without any of the careful delicacy most people employed when raising the subject. "Your engagement ended publicly, and I imagine the consequences of that have followed you well beyond the drawing room where it happened." "They have," Eleanor said simply. There seemed little use in pretending otherwise, not with a man who had already proven he preferred plain speech to polite fiction. "I have a proposal that may interest you, though I want to be clear from the outset that it is not the sort of proposal you may be expecting." He took his own seat, folding his hands on the table before him. "I require a hostess for a series of events I intend to hold over the coming months, gatherings meant to secure certain business relationships that depend as much on social confidence as on financial terms. My sister, who once managed such matters for me, married last year and moved to the north. I have not found her equal since." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the practicality of the request. "You wish to hire me as a hostess?" "I wish to enter an arrangement that benefits us both," he corrected. "You would receive a formal position within my household, respectable in every regard, along with an income and a standing that would make it considerably more difficult for anyone to continue treating you as an object of pity or scandal." In exchange, I would receive the services of a woman capable of managing social matters with more skill and honesty than most of the women currently competing for my attention at every gathering I am unfortunate enough to attend. And you believe I am suited to this? I believe you handled the worst moment of your life without flinching, in front of an audience that would have destroyed most people, he said. That is not a small thing, Miss Whitmore. Most of society mistakes composure for coldness, but I have found it is usually the opposite. Cold people fall apart the moment the room stops watching them. Composed people remain steady long after everyone else has stopped paying attention. Eleanor considered his words carefully, searching for the trap she still half expected to find somewhere in the offer. Forgive me if I ask a blunt question, Your Grace, but why not simply hire someone with experience in such matters, rather than a woman whose name is currently attached to a very public scandal, because experience is common. What you demonstrated at that auction, and again in how you have conducted yourself since, is not. He met her eyes directly, without softening the assessment in any way that might have made it feel like flattery rather than fact. I have no interest in a hostess who will wilt the moment a guest mentions your broken engagement. I require someone who can meet that subject or any other unpleasant subject that arises without losing her composure. You have already proven you can do that under far worse circumstances than anything my dinners are likely to produce. The arrangement he described was unlike anything Eleanor had imagined when she opened his letter days earlier. It offered her something she had not realized she still wanted: a purpose, a place, a means of standing in society again without depending on the goodwill of people who had already shown her how quickly that goodwill could vanish. She asked careful questions about the terms, the income, the expectations placed upon her, and found that the Duke answered each one directly, without evasion, as though he respected her enough to expect the same plain dealing in return. She agreed before the evening ended, and though nothing about the arrangement resembled romance, she left Ashcombe House that night feeling steadier than she had in weeks. News of the arrangement did not stay quiet for long. Within a fortnight, word had spread through the county that Eleanor Whitmore, so recently disgraced, had secured a formal position within the household of the Duke of Ashcombe, one of the wealthiest and most private men in the region. Some praised her resourcefulness. Others whispered darker interpretations, suggesting that a woman so recently humiliated had wasted no time securing herself a wealthy protector, or worse, that she had used whatever charm remained to her to entrap a man known for avoiding exactly such entanglements. Edmund Halsey heard the news within days, and it did not sit well with him. He had expected Eleanor to disappear quietly into whatever smaller life remained available to a disgraced woman, and instead found himself hearing her name mentioned with growing frequency, connected now to a man whose standing far exceeded his own. The comparison stung more than he cared to admit, and though he told himself he felt nothing but mild curiosity about his former fiancée's new arrangement, the frequency with which he brought up the subject in conversation suggested otherwise. Charlotte Vane felt the sting more sharply still. She had spent weeks enjoying the small triumph of having secured Edmund's affection, savoring the attention that came with being seen at his side in place of the woman she had betrayed. News of Eleanor's rising fortune threatened to undo that triumph entirely, and Charlotte found herself, much to her own private shame, unable to stop thinking about it. "She has landed a duke," Charlotte said one evening, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice, as she and Edmund sat together in her family's parlor. "After everything, she has landed a duke, while we are left to manage on what your family provides." "It is a household position, not a marriage," Edmund replied, though his tone carried less certainty than his words suggested. "There is no indication he intends anything further." "Are you certain of that? A man like Ashcombe does not simply invite a disgraced woman into his household without reason." Edmund had no answer for that, and the silence between them stretched long enough to reveal how much the question had unsettled them both. It was Charlotte who first suggested that something be done to correct what she called a dangerous misunderstanding. If society believed Eleanor had secured her position through honest merit, that belief would only continue to elevate her, and elevate the shame Charlotte and Edmund had worked so hard to leave behind them. But if a different story could be planted, one suggesting Eleanor had used deception or manipulation to secure the Duke's favor, perhaps her rising fortune could be turned back into the same kind of scandal that had once worked in Charlotte's favor. The rumor began small, whispered first among a handful of acquaintances who Charlotte knew would repeat it without hesitation. Eleanor Whitmore, the story went, had not been hired for her honesty at all, but had instead invented a tale of victimhood to win the Duke's sympathy, exaggerating the circumstances of her broken engagement to paint herself as wronged, when in truth she had driven Edmund away long before Charlotte ever entered the picture. It was a clever lie, built from just enough truth to make it difficult to disprove entirely, since no one outside that drawing room could say with certainty what words had passed between the three of them before the engagement collapsed. The story spread quickly, as such stories always did, gaining new details with each retelling, until Eleanor herself scarcely recognized the version of events being whispered about her in drawing rooms across the county. She heard fragments of it first from her aunt, who returned from a visit to a neighboring household with a troubled expression and a reluctance to repeat what she had heard. "Tell me," Eleanor said, when her aunt finally admitted something was wrong. Margaret relayed what she had heard as gently as she could, though there was no gentle way to deliver news of such deliberate cruelty. Eleanor listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, feeling something cold and familiar settle over her, the same helplessness she had felt standing in that drawing room weeks earlier, watching Edmund choose his words carefully while offering her none of the truth she deserved. "It is not true," Eleanor said finally. "None of it is true." "I know that," Margaret said, "but knowing it and stopping it from spreading are two very different matters." Eleanor understood the problem all too well. She had no power to correct a rumor once it had taken hold, no platform from which to speak that would carry the same weight as the whispers already circulating through every parlor in the county. She could deny the story to anyone who asked her directly, but for every person who heard her denial, a dozen more would hear only the original lie, repeated with the particular relish gossip always seemed to generate. She considered, briefly, whether to bring the matter to the Duke, but something in her hesitated. Their arrangement was built on practicality, not friendship, and she did not wish to burden him with a problem that was, in truth, entirely her own to manage. She had promised herself weeks ago that she would not spend her new life waiting to be rescued from every difficulty that arose. This felt like a difficulty she needed to face on her own terms. But the rumor did not stay contained to whispered conversations for long. It reached the Duke's own social circle within days, carried by guests who had heard the story secondhand and repeated it, some out of genuine concern, others simply because scandal traveled faster than any other kind of news. By the time the Duke held his next gathering, an evening intended to secure a shipping contract with a visiting merchant family, Eleanor could feel the shift in how certain guests regarded her, the careful, assessing glances that suggested they had heard the whispered version of her story and were waiting to see how she would carry herself under its weight. She managed the evening with the same composure she had managed everything else since her engagement collapsed, greeting guests warmly, guiding conversation with practiced skill, refusing to acknowledge even by the flicker of an expression that she knew what was being said about her behind polite smiles. But the strain of it settled into her shoulders as the night wore on, and by the time the last guests departed, she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. The Duke found her afterward, standing alone, near the now empty drawing room, staring at nothing in particular. "You performed well tonight," he said, "better than the circumstances deserved." Eleanor turned to him, startled that he had noticed anything beyond the surface success of the evening. "You know then." "I have known for several days." His expression was difficult to read, though something in his tone suggested the rumor had not sat well with him at all. "I chose not to raise it until you did, out of respect for the fact that it is your history being distorted, not mine. But I will not pretend I have not been considering what to do about it." "There is nothing to be done," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. "A rumor, once it spreads, cannot simply be unsaid. Perhaps not by you," the Duke said quietly, "but I have found that certain kinds of correction carry more weight when they come from someone the county is less inclined to doubt." She did not ask him to explain further that night, sensing that he preferred to act rather than to promise, and she returned to her aunt's house with a small, cautious flicker of relief settling somewhere beneath the exhaustion of the evening. The following days brought no immediate change, and Eleanor began to wonder whether the Duke's quiet words had been little more than a passing reassurance meant to ease her through a difficult evening rather than any real intention to act. She continued her duties within his household, arranging correspondence, managing the details of upcoming gatherings, and doing her best to ignore the sidelong glances that still followed her whenever she appeared in public. She had grown skilled, in the weeks since her engagement ended, at carrying herself as though such glances did not wound her, though the effort of it left her more tired than she cared to admit even to her aunt. Charlotte, meanwhile, found herself growing bolder as the rumor continued to spread unchecked. She had expected some retaliation, some sign that Eleanor or the Duke intended to correct the story, and when none came, she allowed herself to believe the lie had settled comfortably into place, unlikely to be dislodged. She began repeating it more openly herself, no longer content to let others carry the story on her behalf, adding small embellishments here and there that painted Eleanor in an increasingly unflattering light. It was at a gathering hosted by one of the county's more prominent families, an event Eleanor had not been invited to attend but which the Duke was expected at due to his business dealings with the host, that Charlotte made her boldest move yet. Standing among a cluster of guests near the refreshment table, she repeated the rumor directly within earshot of several people whose opinions carried real weight in local society, embellishing it further with a detail suggesting that Eleanor had once confided in her, years earlier, a plan to secure a wealthy match regardless of the cost to anyone standing in her way. It was a cruel invention, made crueler by how plausible Charlotte made it sound, drawing on years of genuine friendship to lend false credibility to a story built entirely from spite. Several guests nodded along, their expressions shifting towards something like vindication, as though Charlotte's account finally explained a mystery that had puzzled them since news of Eleanor's new position first reached their ears. What Charlotte did not realize, standing in the middle of that crowded room, was that the Duke of Ashcombe stood only a few feet away, having arrived earlier than expected and paused near the edge of the gathering to speak with his host before making his presence more widely known. He heard every word Charlotte spoke, delivered with such practiced sincerity that anyone unfamiliar with the truth would have believed her without hesitation. His expression did not change as he listened, though something in his posture grew noticeably still, the particular stillness of a man deciding how best to respond to a provocation, rather than reacting to it in the heat of the moment. He did not interrupt Charlotte's account, choosing instead to let her finish, gathering every detail of the lie she had constructed before deciding what to do with it. When she finished speaking, satisfied by the murmurs of agreement that followed, the Duke stepped forward into the circle of guests, his sudden presence drawing immediate silence. "Miss Vane," he said, his voice carrying the same calm precision he used in every conversation, though something colder ran beneath it now. "I could not help but overhear your account of Miss Whitmore's character. I find it curious, given that I have spent considerably more time in her company these past weeks than you appear to have spent in mine, and nothing in her conduct resembles the woman you have just described." Charlotte's face drained of color, her earlier confidence collapsing under the weight of his attention. "Your Grace, I only meant—" "I am certain you meant precisely what you said," he interrupted, not unkindly, but without any softness either. "I simply wished those present to understand that the story circulating about Miss Whitmore did not originate from any fault of her own, but from someone with a clear and rather obvious motive to see her reputation suffer in place of her own." The silence that followed his words was heavier than any that had come before it. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly reassessing everything they had just heard, while Charlotte stood frozen, unable to summon any response that might undo the damage his simple, direct correction had caused. By morning, the true version of events had begun spreading through the county, with the same speed the false one once had, carried now by guests eager to share what they had witnessed firsthand rather than repeat second-hand gossip. Eleanor heard of it from her aunt over breakfast, and though she said little in response, something in her chest loosened for the first time in days, as though a weight she had grown almost accustomed to carrying had finally been set down. Eleanor did not thank the Duke for what he had done, though she thought about it for days afterward, turning the moment over in her mind, until she was no longer certain what she owed him or how to offer it. She found him in his study one afternoon, reviewing shipping accounts with the same quiet focus he applied to everything, and she stood in the doorway a moment before he noticed her presence and set down his pen. "Miss Whitmore, I wish to speak with you about what happened at the Ashford gathering," she said, stepping into the room though she had not been invited to sit. "You did not need to correct Charlotte in front of everyone. It was not your responsibility to defend my reputation." "No," he agreed. "It was not." "Then why did you?" He considered the question longer than she expected, as though it deserved more thought than the simple answer he eventually gave. "Because a lie was being told in my presence about someone whose conduct I have observed closely enough to know the truth. I do not particularly enjoy watching falsehoods spread unchallenged, regardless of whose reputation they concern." It was a practical answer, delivered without warmth, and yet Eleanor found herself studying him more carefully than she had before, searching for something beneath the plain explanation that he did not seem inclined to offer outright. "Still," she said, "thank you." He inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude without dwelling on it, and returned his attention to the ledger before him as though the matter were settled. But Eleanor lingered a moment longer, and when she finally turned to leave, she noticed something she had not expected to notice. The faintest trace of satisfaction in his expression, quickly smoothed away, as though he had not intended for her to see it at all. In the weeks that followed, their working relationship settled into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated when the arrangement first began. Eleanor managed the details of his household gatherings with growing confidence, no longer burdened by the constant awareness of whispered rumors following her through every room. The Duke, for his part, began consulting her on matters beyond the strictly social, asking her opinion on which guests might respond favorably to certain business proposals, which families held influence worth cultivating, which alliances were worth the trouble of pursuing. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she enjoyed the work far more than she had expected to. There was a particular satisfaction in being valued for her judgment rather than her connections or her prospects, in being asked what she thought rather than simply what she wanted, and she began to understand why the Duke had insisted, from their very first conversation, that he required someone capable of more than pleasant conversation and careful table settings. Their conversations, too, began to extend beyond the strict boundaries of business. He asked her once, over a late supper following a particularly demanding evening of hosting, whether she regretted the life she had left behind. "I regret trusting the wrong people," she said, after a moment's thought. "I do not regret the life itself, only my blindness to what was happening within it. Charlotte deceived you for a long time, I imagine. Longer than I care to consider." Eleanor turned her glass slowly between her fingers, watching the candlelight catch in the wine. "The strangest part is not the deception itself. It is realizing how much of what I believed about our friendship was built on things she allowed me to believe, rather than things that were actually true." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable in the low light. "I understand something of that feeling, though the circumstances were different. My father's advisors spent years telling him what he wished to hear, rather than what was true, and by the time I inherited the estate, the damage their flattery had caused took nearly a decade to undo. I learned early that the people most willing to tell you comfortable lies are rarely the people worth trusting." It was the first time he had spoken to her of anything resembling his own past, and Eleanor found herself listening more closely than she expected, aware of a shift in the conversation that felt different from the careful professionalism that had defined their exchanges until now. "Is that why you value honesty so highly?" she asked, "even when it is unflattering?" "Perhaps." He met her eyes across the table, something steady and considering in his gaze. "I find I would rather hear an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie, in business and elsewhere. It saves considerable time in the long run." Eleanor smiled, faintly but genuinely, the first real smile she had offered him since their arrangement began. "I will try to remember that, Your Grace, the next time I am tempted to soften bad news for your benefit." "Please do not soften it," he said. "I find I trust your judgment considerably more than most people's careful diplomacy." The compliment, plain as it was, settled somewhere warm in Eleanor's chest, and she found herself thinking of it often in the days that followed, turning the words over the way she might once have turned over Edmund's careless flattery, though this felt entirely different in nature. Edmund's words had always been designed to please her, calculated for effect. The Duke's words carried no such calculation. He simply said what he believed to be true, and somehow that made them mean considerably more. The most telling moment came several days later, when the Duke faced a difficult decision regarding a merchant family seeking to expand their business partnership with his shipping ventures. The family, prosperous and well-connected, had offered generous terms, but something in their manner during recent visits had struck Eleanor as calculated rather than genuine, a subtle eagerness that suggested motives beyond simple trade advantage. She raised her concerns carefully, aware that questioning a matter so far outside her formal responsibilities might be seen as overstepping. "Your Grace, I do not wish to speak beyond my place, but I have noticed something in Mr. Ellery's manner that troubles me." "Go on," the Duke said, setting aside the contract he had been reviewing, his full attention turning toward her without hesitation. "He speaks a great deal about the honor of partnership, and very little about the specific terms of repayment should the venture underperform. In my experience, men confident in their own success rarely need to speak so often of honor. It is usually the ones with something to hide who mention it most." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes as he turned her observation over in his mind. "You believe he intends to default and is building goodwill now to soften the consequences later. I could not say for certain, it is only an impression. Your impressions have proven accurate before." He rose from his desk and crossed to the window, considering the grounds beyond in silence for a moment, before turning back to her. "I will have the terms reviewed more carefully before proceeding. Thank you, Miss Whitmore." It was a small exchange, unremarkable to anyone who might have overheard it, but it marked a turning point in how Eleanor understood her place within the household. She was no longer simply managing guest lists and seating arrangements. She had become, without quite realizing when the shift occurred, someone whose judgment the Duke actively sought and weighed alongside his own, and the realization settled into her with quiet, unexpected pride. A week later, his caution proved justified. The merchant family's finances, examined more closely at the Duke's request, revealed exactly the instability Eleanor had suspected, and the partnership was restructured on considerably safer terms before any harm could come to the estate's interests. The Duke said little about it afterward, beyond a brief acknowledgement over supper that her instincts had likely saved him a considerable sum, but Eleanor noticed the way his manner toward her shifted subtly in the days that followed, a new ease settling between them that had not been present before, as though some quiet test had been passed and some quiet trust had been earned in its place. Word of their growing closeness did not escape the notice of local society, though the nature of it remained a subject of considerable speculation. Some assumed the arrangement had always been intended to lead toward marriage, despite the Duke's well-known reluctance toward such matters. Others insisted it remained purely professional, pointing to the strictly formal nature of Eleanor's position within his household as evidence that nothing more was intended. Eleanor herself was uncertain what to make of the shift, uncertain whether the growing ease between them reflected genuine regard or simply the natural comfort that developed between two people who spent considerable time in each other's company. She told herself it did not matter either way, that the security and purpose her position provided were more than sufficient reward for the difficult months she had endured, and that she should not allow herself to hope for anything beyond what had already been generously offered. But hope, once it took root, proved difficult to uproot entirely. She noticed small things she might once have dismissed as coincidence, the way the Duke made time in his schedule for their conversations even during the busiest weeks of his business dealings, the way he asked after her well-being with a consistency that seemed to exceed simple courtesy, the way his expression softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever she made an observation that surprised him or challenged his assumptions rather than simply agreeing with whatever he proposed. She mentioned none of this to her aunt, unwilling to give voice to hopes that might yet prove unfounded. But Margaret noticed the change in her niece regardless, the particular lightness that had crept into Eleanor's manner over the preceding weeks, so different from the careful composure she had maintained in the months immediately following her broken engagement. "You seem happier," Margaret observed one evening, as Eleanor prepared to return to Ashcombe House for another evening of hosting. "I am occupied," Eleanor said. "There is satisfaction in useful work." "Is that all it is?" Eleanor did not answer immediately, choosing instead to focus on the clasp of her cloak rather than meet her aunt's knowing expression. "I do not know what else it might be, Aunt Margaret. I have learned not to trust my own judgment too quickly where such matters are concerned." "A reasonable caution," Margaret agreed, "but caution and denial are not the same thing, my dear. Whatever is growing between you and that man, I do not think it will remain hidden much longer, whether you choose to name it or not." Eleanor said nothing further, but she carried her aunt's words with her that evening, turning them over as the carriage carried her toward Ashcombe House beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, wondering, despite every effort to guard against it, whether her aunt might be right. She arrived to find the household already in motion, servants moving briskly between rooms in preparation for a gathering scheduled for the following week, one meant to formalize the very partnership her instincts had helped protect. The Duke met her in the entrance hall, and something in the easy way he fell into step beside her, discussing the evening's arrangements as naturally as if they had done so 100 times before, struck her as different from the careful formality that had once defined their exchanges. "I have been thinking," he said, as they walked together toward the study, "that you have proven yourself considerably more valuable to this household than I anticipated when I first proposed our arrangement. I hope that is meant as a compliment, Your Grace." "It is meant as an observation, though I suppose the two are not always separate." He paused at the study door, turning to face her fully. "I did not expect, when I extended that invitation weeks ago, that our arrangement would come to feel less like an exchange of services and more like a partnership. I find I value your counsel a great deal, Miss Whitmore, on matters well beyond the management of my dinners." Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the admission, though she kept her expression carefully composed, unwilling to reveal how much his words affected her. "I have found the work considerably more fulfilling than I expected as well, Your Grace. There is a satisfaction in being useful for one's judgment rather than merely one's presence at a gathering." "Yes," he said quietly, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "I imagine there is." Neither of them said anything further on the matter, but the moment lingered between them as they entered the study, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since her engagement had ended in ruin, allowing herself to imagine a future that held something more than mere survival within it. That night, as the carriage carried her home along the dark, quiet road back to her aunt's cottage, Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and let herself, just for a moment, consider the shape of what might be growing between them. She was careful, still, not to name it fully, mindful of how quickly hope had betrayed her once before. But the caution felt different this time, less like fear and more like patience, the quiet steadiness of a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment again, and who intended to let whatever was building between herself and the Duke unfold at its own honest pace. Edmund Halsey's business had begun to falter, though he had told no one outside his own household exactly how badly. The shipping contracts he had once relied upon through his family's modest trading interests had grown unreliable since a rival firm, backed by considerably more capital, had begun undercutting his prices in every port his family traded through. He had assumed, when he first heard rumors of the rival's growing influence, that the situation would resolve itself in time. Instead, month after month, his family's fortunes continued to shrink, and with them, the comfortable future he had once imagined for himself and Charlotte. He did not know, until a business associate mentioned it in passing over drinks one evening, that the rival firm undercutting his prices belonged to the Duke of Ashcombe. The realization struck him with an unpleasant jolt. He had known, of course, that Eleanor now worked within the Duke's household, and he had told himself repeatedly that the arrangement meant nothing beyond simple employment. But learning that the very man responsible for his family's declining fortunes was the same man now closely associated with the woman he had wronged, felt like more than coincidence, and a small, ugly suspicion began forming in his mind that perhaps this was no accident at all. He raised the matter with Charlotte that same night, pacing the length of her family's parlor while she watched him with growing alarm. "You believe Eleanor arranged this," Charlotte said slowly, trying to follow the logic he seemed to have already convinced himself of. "That she somehow influenced the Duke to ruin your family's business out of spite. I believe it is a remarkable coincidence, if it is one at all," Edmund said. "She works closely with him. She manages his affairs, his correspondence, his social arrangements. It would not take much for her to plant a suggestion, to steer his attention toward our contracts. That seems a great deal to assume from mere proximity." "Does it?" Edmund stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully. "She has every reason to want us ruined, Charlotte. We humiliated her in front of both our families. Now she finds herself in a position of considerable influence over a man wealthy enough to destroy anyone he chooses. I would not put it past her to use that influence exactly as I have described." Charlotte said nothing for a long moment, uncertain whether she believed his theory or simply wanted to believe it, since it offered a far more satisfying explanation for their misfortune than the plain truth of poor business decisions and unfavorable market conditions. But the alternative, that their own carelessness had brought them to this point, was considerably harder to accept than the notion that Eleanor had somehow engineered their downfall from a position of newfound power. "What do you intend to do about it?" she asked finally. Edmund's expression hardened into something calculating. "I intend to speak with the Duke directly. If Eleanor has been poisoning his opinion of my family for her own petty revenge, he deserves to know the truth of who he has invited into his household." Charlotte hesitated only briefly before nodding her agreement, driven less by conviction than by desperation, unwilling to watch the comfortable future she had staked everything on collapse, without at least attempting to salvage it. Edmund secured an audience with the Duke through a mutual business acquaintance, presenting himself at Ashcombe House several days later with a carefully rehearsed account of Eleanor's supposed manipulation. He was received in the same study where the Duke conducted most of his business dealings, and he noted, with a flicker of something like satisfaction, that the room's stark practicality suggested a man perhaps more susceptible to persuasion than the elegant drawing rooms of higher society might have produced. "Your Grace," Edmund began, once the customary pleasantries had been exchanged, "I appreciate you receiving me on short notice. I have come regarding a delicate matter concerning your household." "Go on," the Duke said, his expression giving away nothing of what he already suspected about the purpose of this visit. "It concerns Miss Whitmore." Edmund chose his words carefully, aware that clumsy accusations would only undermine whatever credibility he hoped to establish. "I feel obligated, as someone who knew her for a considerable time before recent events, to share certain concerns about her character that you may not yet be aware of." "I am listening." Edmund proceeded to lay out his theory with practiced smoothness, describing Eleanor's supposed resentment toward him and Charlotte, her position of influence within the Duke's affairs, and the suspicious timing of his family's declining business fortunes relative to the Duke's expanding shipping interests in the same trade routes his family had relied upon for generations. He framed it not as an accusation but as a concerned warning, the sort of information a responsible man might feel compelled to share, regardless of the personal cost to himself. The Duke listened to the entire account without interrupting, his expression remaining carefully neutral throughout, though anyone who knew him well might have noticed the particular stillness that settled over him as Edmund spoke, the same quiet, controlled focus he brought to any negotiation he intended to win decisively. When Edmund finished, the Duke was silent for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made Edmund shift uncomfortably in his seat. "That is a remarkable theory, Mr. Halsey," the Duke said finally. "I find myself curious about one particular detail. You claim my business decisions regarding shipping routes were influenced by Miss Whitmore's personal grievances against you and Miss Vane. Yet those decisions were made nearly 2 months before Miss Whitmore ever entered my household. My interest in expanding along those particular trade routes predates our acquaintance by a considerable margin." Edmund's confidence faltered, though he tried to recover quickly. "Perhaps she influenced you to continue that expansion more aggressively than you otherwise might have. Or perhaps," the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly, "your family's business has struggled because it failed to adapt to changing market conditions that every other trading house in this county recognized and adjusted for accordingly. I did not target your family, Mr. Halsey. I expanded my interests in the most sensible direction available to me, one that happened to compete with your existing contracts because your existing contracts occupied one of the few remaining profitable routes in the region. Your misfortune is a matter of poor business planning, not personal vengeance." The bluntness of the assessment left Edmund momentarily speechless, the careful narrative he had constructed collapsing under the weight of facts he had not anticipated the Duke would possess so readily. "I see," Edmund managed finally, though the words came out considerably less confident than they had when he first entered the room. "I do not think you fully do," the Duke continued, rising from his desk and crossing to stand before the window, his back to Edmund as he spoke. "You came here today hoping to convince me that Miss Whitmore is dangerous, manipulative, deserving of suspicion rather than trust. I find it curious that a man who publicly humiliated her in front of both your families, who chose her closest friend over her without hesitation or apparent remorse, now wishes to paint her as the villain in whatever misfortune has befallen his own affairs." He turned back to face Edmund, and whatever patience he had extended at the beginning of the conversation had clearly worn thin. "I have observed Miss Whitmore closely for several months now, Mr. Halsey. I have seen her manage difficult situations with more grace and honesty than most people I have known in considerably longer acquaintance. I have seen her endure public humiliation without seeking revenge, without spreading lies of her own, without doing anything beyond quietly rebuilding a life that you and Miss Vane worked very hard to destroy. Nothing in her conduct resembles the scheming woman you have described today." Edmund opened his mouth to protest, but the Duke continued before he could speak. "I would also remind you," the Duke said, his voice carrying a coldness that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several degrees, "that I am not a man who takes kindly to being used as an instrument of someone else's grievances. You came here today hoping I might sever my professional association with Miss Whitmore based on unfounded suspicion, perhaps hoping the resulting scandal might restore some measure of your own diminished standing at her expense. I find that considerably more troubling than anything you have accused her of." "That was not my intention," Edmund said, though the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "Whatever your intention, the result would have been the same, had I been foolish enough to believe you." The Duke returned to his desk, signaling clearly that the audience had reached its conclusion. "I think we are finished here, Mr. Halsey. I would advise you to focus your remaining energy on salvaging your own affairs, rather than attempting to damage Miss Whitmore's, since I can assure you the latter effort will find no success in this household." Edmund left Ashcombe House considerably more shaken than he had arrived, his careful theory in ruins, his family's business troubles no closer to resolution than before, and a new, unwelcome awareness settling over him that the Duke's regard for Eleanor ran deeper than simple professional respect, deep enough that any attempt to turn him against her had never stood a real chance of succeeding. The carriage ride home passed in a haze of wounded pride and mounting dread. Edmund replayed the conversation over and over, searching for the moment where his argument might have found firmer footing, but each time he arrived at the same conclusion. The Duke had already made up his mind about Eleanor long before Edmund ever walked through his door, and no arrangement of facts, however carefully presented, was going to shake a conviction built on months of direct observation rather than second-hand rumor. What troubled him most, though he was reluctant to examine the feeling too closely, was the realization that the Duke's assessment of him had not been entirely unfair. He had chosen Charlotte over Eleanor without hesitation, without apparent remorse, in front of both their families. He had let Eleanor walk out of that drawing room to face the consequences alone while he remained behind to manage his own reputation. Hearing those choices described plainly by a man with no stake in flattering him had struck harder than he cared to admit. He said nothing of this quieter reflection to Charlotte, unwilling to give voice to doubts that might unravel whatever remained of the life they had built together since that first betrayal. Instead, he retreated into a kind of brittle silence over the following days, avoiding conversation about the Duke, about Eleanor, about the business troubles that continued to mount with each passing week. Charlotte, for her part, grew increasingly desperate as their circumstances worsened. She had staked her entire future on the belief that choosing Edmund, despite the cost to her friendship with Eleanor, would secure her a comfortable and stable life. Watching that stability erode week by week, while Eleanor's own fortunes climbed steadily higher under the Duke's patronage, produced a bitterness in her that she found increasingly difficult to hide, even from herself. She attempted once more to salvage some advantage from the situation, calling on a distant cousin who maintained connections within the Duke's social circle, hoping to gather some piece of information that might yet be used to her benefit. But the cousin, having already heard the full account of Edmund's failed confrontation, offered her only a cool reception and a pointed suggestion that she would be wise to distance herself from any further attempts to interfere in the Duke's affairs. "The whole county knows what happened," the cousin said, without much sympathy in her tone. "You would do better to focus on repairing what remains of your own standing than pursuing a battle you have already lost twice over." Charlotte left that visit with nothing gained and considerably more humiliation added to what she already carried, and for the first time since the morning she had chosen Edmund over her oldest friend, she allowed herself to wonder whether the choice had been worth what it had cost her. He said nothing of the meeting's true outcome when Charlotte asked how it had gone, offering only a vague, unsatisfying account that left her more anxious than before. But the truth found its way to her eventually, as truth in that county always seemed to, carried by servants and business associates, until the full, humiliating account of Edmund's failed audience with the Duke had spread nearly as widely as the original false rumor Charlotte herself had once set in motion. The final and most painful indignity came when the merchant family Edmund had hoped to secure additional financing from, having heard of his attempt to manipulate the Duke of Ashcombe through baseless accusation, quietly withdrew their own remaining support, unwilling to associate their name with a man whose judgment had proven so poor and whose methods so distasteful. Within weeks, what remained of Edmund's family business contracted further still, leaving him and Charlotte with considerably less security than either had possessed even in the uncertain months immediately following Eleanor's departure from their lives. Eleanor learned of the failed confrontation only after it had already concluded, when the Duke mentioned it briefly over supper one evening, his tone carrying none of the satisfaction she might have expected from a man who had just decisively defended her honor. "You did not need to intervene," she said, once he had finished the account. "I have grown accustomed to defending myself against whatever they choose to say." "I know you have," the Duke said, "but I find I am no longer willing to stand by while people who have already caused you considerable harm attempt to cause you more, particularly when their methods involve attacking your character to a man they hoped might believe lies over the truth he has already witnessed for himself." Eleanor studied him across the table, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest at the quiet conviction in his voice. "You sound almost protective, Your Grace." "Perhaps I am," he said simply, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "I find I have grown considerably more invested in your well-being than our original arrangement ever required of me." The admission hung between them, plain and unadorned in the way all his words tended to be, and Eleanor understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever remained unspoken between them would not remain unspoken for very much longer. She left Ashcombe House that evening in a state she had not felt in a very long time, something closer to hope than she had allowed herself to feel since the morning her old life fell apart. She thought, as the carriage rolled along the quiet road home, of how differently this year had unfolded from anything she once imagined for herself. She had expected, on the morning of her wedding contract signing, to spend her life as Edmund's wife, content with a comfortable but unremarkable future. Instead, she had lost everything she thought she wanted, only to find something she had never dared to hope for in its place, built not on convenient arrangement but on genuine respect, tested honesty, and a steadiness she had never once experienced with Edmund, even in their happiest days together. Her aunt noticed the change in her the moment she returned, the particular brightness in her expression that no amount of careful composure could fully disguise. "You look like a woman who has just been told something important," Margaret observed, setting aside her needlework as Eleanor entered the parlor. "Perhaps I have," Eleanor said, unable to keep the small smile from her lips as she settled into the chair across from her aunt. "Or perhaps I have simply allowed myself, for the first time in a very long while, to believe that something good might actually be permitted to last." Margaret studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Good things last longest, my dear, when they are built the way yours has been, slowly, and on solid ground, rather than rushed into being out of desperation or convenience. Whatever is coming, I suspect it will hold." The invitation that arrived at Ashcombe House 3 weeks later was unlike any other Eleanor had helped arrange during her months managing the Duke's affairs. It was a formal gathering, larger than any he had hosted since her arrival, intended to celebrate the successful conclusion of a shipping venture that had secured the estate's finances for years to come. The guest list included nearly every prominent family in the county, and Eleanor understood, as she reviewed the arrangements with her usual care, that this event would draw a considerably wider audience than any private business dinner or modest gathering she had managed before. She also understood, though the Duke had said nothing explicit to confirm it, that this gathering carried significance beyond the business achievement it ostensibly celebrated. In the days leading up to the event, she noticed small changes in his manner toward her, changes that suggested something had shifted decisively since the evening he admitted his growing investment in her well-being. He sought her company more deliberately now, no longer confining their conversations strictly to household matters or business concerns. He asked after her thoughts on subjects that had nothing to do with either, her opinions on books she had read, her memories of childhood before scandal had reshaped her life, the small details of who she was beyond the composed, capable woman he had first noticed at that charity auction so many months before. "You are curious about me," she observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens behind Ashcombe House, the last warm days of the season lending the grounds a soft golden light. "I find I am," he admitted, without any of the careful reserve he had once brought to such admissions. "I have spent a great deal of time learning what you are capable of, Miss Whitmore. I find myself wanting, now, to understand who you are, beneath all that capability." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the directness of the admission, though she kept her voice steady when she replied. "That is a considerably more personal question than any you have asked me before, Your Grace. I am aware of that." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the shade of an old elm tree, its branches heavy with the first colors of autumn. "I have spent most of my life keeping people at a careful distance, Miss Whitmore. My father's advisors taught me, through considerable pain, that closeness often invites betrayal. I have avoided courtship for that very reason, unwilling to risk discovering that the woman who claimed to care for me cared considerably more for my title and my fortune." "And yet you have grown close to me regardless," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes." He held her gaze steadily, no trace of hesitation in his expression. "I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer wish to keep that careful distance where you are concerned. You have shown me, repeatedly, that your regard for me has nothing to do with what I can offer you, and everything to do with how I choose to conduct myself. That is rarer than you may realize, and considerably more valuable to me than any business success I have achieved this past year." Eleanor's breath caught at the weight of his words, and she found herself, for a moment, unable to summon any response equal to the sincerity with which he had spoken. "I do not know what to say to that, Your Grace." "You need not say anything today," he said gently. "I only wished you to understand my intentions before the gathering next week. I do not intend to keep them hidden much longer." She thought of little else in the days that followed, turning his words over in quiet moments between the demands of preparing for the upcoming event, wondering exactly what he meant by intentions he no longer wished to keep hidden. She did not ask him to elaborate further, sensing that whatever he planned deserved to unfold in its own time, and she found a strange, steady comfort in that patience, so different from the anxious uncertainty that had once defined her final weeks with Edmund. The evening of the gathering arrived clear and cool, the kind of autumn night that seemed made for the golden candlelight spilling from every window of Ashcombe House. Eleanor had overseen every detail of the preparations herself, and as the first guests began arriving, she allowed herself a small measure of pride at how seamlessly the household had come together under her direction, transformed from a place of quiet, businesslike efficiency into something warm and welcoming for the evening. Edmund and Charlotte had not been invited, a fact Eleanor noted with quiet relief as she moved through the gathering crowd, though she suspected word of the evening's success would reach them regardless, carried by the same efficient gossip that had once spread their cruel lies about her so effectively. She found she no longer felt the sharp sting their names once produced. They had become, over the preceding months, a smaller and smaller part of a life that had grown considerably larger and more meaningful than anything she had once planned to share with either of them. The Duke found her near the edge of the ballroom, where she had paused to survey the gathering with a satisfaction she rarely allowed herself to fully feel. "You have done remarkable work tonight," he said, coming to stand beside her, his gaze taking in the warm, well-ordered scene of guests mingling comfortably beneath the light of a dozen chandeliers. "It was not difficult, given the circumstances worth celebrating," she said. "Your venture's success has given the whole county something pleasant to discuss for once, rather than scandal or misfortune." "Perhaps," he said, "though I find myself considerably more interested in celebrating something other than the shipping venture this evening." Something in his tone made Eleanor turn to look at him fully, and she found his expression carrying a seriousness that had nothing to do with business success. "Your Grace? I asked you once, months ago, to manage my household affairs because I believed you capable of handling difficult circumstances with more grace than most people I had encountered." He held her gaze steadily, his voice low enough that it carried only to her, lost beneath the surrounding conversation and music. "I did not anticipate, when I made that offer, that I would come to value your presence in my life, for reasons that had nothing to do with your capability at all." Eleanor's heart began to race, and she found herself holding perfectly still, afraid that any movement might interrupt whatever he intended to say next. "I have spent this past year watching you rebuild everything that was taken from you, not through bitterness or revenge, but through quiet, steady honesty, that I have come to admire more than I ever expected to admire anything in another person." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers, a gesture more intimate than anything he had permitted himself before. "I do not offer you now what Edmund Halsey once offered you, a convenient match built on family expectation and comfortable arrangement. I offer you something considerably more deliberate. I have chosen you, Eleanor, not because circumstance placed you in my household, but because I have come to know you, closely and honestly, and I find I want no other woman standing beside me for whatever years remain to me." The music and conversation around them seemed to fade into distant noise as Eleanor absorbed the full weight of what he had just said, spoken plainly, without flourish, in the exact manner she had come to recognize as entirely and unmistakably his own. "You are asking me to marry you," she said softly, needing to hear the words confirmed aloud before she allowed herself to fully believe them. "I am," he said, "though I recognize I have not asked in the traditional manner, with elaborate declarations or poetic sentiment. I find I would rather simply tell you the truth, as I always have. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to become my wife." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Eleanor's eyes, though they carried none of the grief that had once accompanied every tear she shed in the months following her broken engagement. These tears were something else entirely, relief and joy and disbelief all tangled together, and she found herself smiling through them as she answered him. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you, Nathaniel." It was the first time she had used his given name, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, warmth spreading across features that had once seemed so carefully guarded against exactly this kind of vulnerability. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, and though neither of them made any grand announcement to the gathered guests that evening, several nearby noticed the exchange, and word of what had passed between the Duke and Miss Whitmore began spreading through the ballroom before the night had even ended. The morning after the announcement, Eleanor woke in her aunt's small cottage for what she knew would be one of the last times, and lay quietly for a while, simply absorbing the strangeness of how quickly a life could change course. A year earlier, she had woken in her father's house believing her future settled, certain of a comfortable marriage to a man she had known since childhood. That certainty had shattered in a single terrible morning, and in its place had grown something she never could have planned for, built slowly through honesty and patience, rather than through the familiar comfort of a match arranged by family expectation. She wrote to her father that same day, sharing the news before it could reach him through gossip, and his reply arrived within days, full of a joy that nearly matched her own. He had watched her endure the worst months of her life with a helplessness that had clearly weighed on him, and his letter made plain how deeply relieved he was to see her happiness restored, this time on foundations considerably sturdier than the ones that had failed her before. Aunt Margaret, for her part, took considerable satisfaction in reminding Eleanor, on more than one occasion in the weeks that followed, that she had seen the Duke's interest taking shape long before Eleanor herself was willing to acknowledge it. I told you that very first evening that a man like that does not simply speak to a woman without reason, she said, smiling over her needlework one quiet afternoon. I merely did not expect the reason to prove quite so thorough. Eleanor spent the following weeks dividing her time between the practical demands of wedding preparations and her continuing responsibilities within Nathaniel's household, though he insisted, with growing frequency, that she allow herself more rest than her naturally diligent temperament preferred. She found herself, in quiet moments, marveling at how completely her understanding of partnership had shifted since the collapse of her engagement to Edmund. Where her old relationship had been built on assumption and convenient silence, this one seemed built on the opposite instinct entirely. A determination on both their parts to say plainly whatever needed saying, however uncomfortable the truth might occasionally prove. By the time news reached Edmund and Charlotte, delivered by an acquaintance eager to share the latest county gossip, the engagement had already been formally announced, and the wedding date set for the coming spring. Charlotte received the news in silence, staring out the window of her family's parlor at nothing in particular, while Edmund said nothing at all, understanding at last, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be of any use to him, exactly what he had thrown away on that terrible morning so many months before. Their own circumstances continued their quiet decline in the months that followed. Without the support of the merchant families who had once considered partnering with Edmund's trading interests, and without the social standing that had once made Charlotte's company sought after among the county's finer households, the two of them settled into a smaller, more modest existence than either had ever imagined for themselves. Neither spoke often of Eleanor after that, though both, in their private moments, found it difficult entirely to escape the knowledge of what they had discarded and what she had gone on to build in its place. Eleanor's wedding, when it finally arrived, bore little resemblance to the quiet, modest ceremony she had once planned with Edmund. It was a grand affair, attended by nearly the entire county, held in the same gardens where the Duke had first admitted his growing regard for her, beneath the shade of the old elm tree. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, proud beyond words of the daughter who had rebuilt her entire life from the wreckage of a single terrible morning, and Aunt Margaret sat in the front row, dabbing at her own eyes while wearing an expression of unmistakable satisfaction, as though she alone had known, from that very first evening at the charity auction, exactly how this story would end. Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of pale gold, watching Nathaniel approach with a steadiness in his gaze that matched the steadiness she had come to rely on in every difficult moment of the past year. She thought, as she took his hands and spoke her vows before the assembled crowd, of how far she had traveled since that morning in the drawing room, how completely her life had transformed from something taken by cruelty into something chosen, deliberately and honestly, by two people who had learned to trust each other, precisely because neither of them had anything left to hide. She did not think of Edmund or Charlotte as she spoke her vows. There was no room left in her heart for the people who had once tried to define her by their betrayal. There was only Nathaniel, steady and true beside her, and the quiet, certain knowledge that whatever had been broken in that terrible drawing room had been rebuilt into something considerably stronger than it had ever been before, chosen not out of necessity or convenience, but out of genuine, hard-won love. When the ceremony ended and the guests rose to applaud, Nathaniel drew her close and spoke softly enough that only she could hear him over the celebration surrounding them. You once told me you preferred to speak the truth yourself, rather than let others shape it for you. I have always admired that about you, more than perhaps anything else. It served me well, Eleanor said, smiling up at him. It brought me here, to this moment, standing beside a man who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am. I would not have wanted you any other way, he said, and the certainty in his voice carried the same steady conviction she had come to rely on since the very first evening they spoke at that crowded charity auction. Whatever comes next, Eleanor, I intend to meet it the way you have always met your own difficulties. Honestly and without fear of what the truth might cost us. The celebration continued long into the evening, filling the gardens of Ashcombe House with laughter and music long after the sun had set behind the distant hills. Eleanor moved through the gathering on her husband's arm, greeting guests who, only a year before, had regarded her with pity or suspicion, and who now offered her nothing but warm congratulations and genuine admiration for the life she had rebuilt from nothing. She thought, more than once that evening, of the frightened, humiliated woman who had fled her father's house in the dark hours before dawn, uncertain of anything except her own refusal to be defined by another person's cruelty. That woman felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone steadier, someone who had learned that the worst mornings of a life did not have to determine everything that followed them. As the last of the evening's light faded and the first stars appeared above the garden, Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to simply stand still and feel the full weight of her own happiness, earned not through luck or rescue, but through her own quiet refusal to be broken by betrayal, and rewarded, in the end, with a love built on nothing but honest, steady truth. 2 years into her marriage, Eleanor stood in the same study where Nathaniel had first proposed their working arrangement, though the room looked considerably different now, warmer, filled with small signs of a shared life rather than the stark practicality that had once defined it. She had taken on responsibilities far beyond hosting his gatherings in the time since their wedding. Nathaniel had come to rely on her judgment so completely that he had begun including her formally in decisions regarding the estate's expanding shipping ventures, a level of involvement almost unheard of for a woman of her position, though neither of them paid much attention to what tradition suggested was proper. They had built their partnership on honesty rather than convention from the very beginning, and saw no reason to abandon that principle now that they were husband and wife rather than employer and employee. It was during this period of quiet stability that word reached them of a fresh scandal brewing around Charlotte and Edmund, though neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel sought the details out deliberately. Their households moved in different circles now, separated not just by fortune but by the natural distance that grows between people whose lives have taken fundamentally different paths. Still, county gossip found its way to every household eventually, and Eleanor heard, secondhand and without much interest, that the pair had married quietly the previous autumn, their union lacking any of the grandeur that had once been expected of Edmund's family before their fortunes declined. She felt, hearing the news, none of the bitterness she once might have expected from herself. There was only a distant, faintly melancholy recognition that two people who had caused her such profound pain now lived considerably smaller lives than the ones they had once imagined for themselves, not through any action of her own, but through the natural consequences of choices they had made without regard for anyone but their own immediate desires. Aunt Margaret visited often during those years, delighting in watching her niece flourish in a role that suited her far better than the quiet, uncertain existence she had once resigned herself to after Edmund's betrayal. On one such visit, settling into the same chair she always favored in the Ashcombe house parlor, Margaret raised a question she had apparently been considering for some time. "Do you ever think of writing to Charlotte?" she asked, watching Eleanor carefully for her reaction. "Not for her sake, necessarily, but for your own peace." Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, aware that a year earlier she might have dismissed it without thought, still too raw from the wound Charlotte's betrayal had left behind. But time and happiness had softened certain edges that once felt permanently sharp. "I do not think I need to," she said finally. "I have made my peace with what happened, not by forgiving her exactly, but by no longer allowing her choices to occupy space in my life that belongs to better things now. Writing to her would only reopen a door I have worked very hard to close, and I see no benefit in reopening it, for her sake or my own." Margaret nodded slowly, seeming satisfied by the answer. "That is wisdom I did not always possess at your age, my dear. Some wounds are better left to heal in silence than reopened in search of resolution that may never come." Nathaniel, when Eleanor shared the conversation with him later that evening, offered a similar sentiment, though delivered with his characteristic directness. "You owe them nothing, Eleanor. Not forgiveness, not correspondence, not even the thought you have already given the matter tonight. They chose their path when they chose each other, over honesty with you. Whatever consequences followed that choice belong entirely to them." "I know that," Eleanor said, settling beside him on the small settee near the study window, the same room where their arrangement had first begun. "I find I think of them less and less as time passes. There is simply too much else in my life now that matters considerably more." It was true, and had become truer with each passing season. Their household had grown busier with the demands of Nathaniel's expanding business interests, and Eleanor found herself increasingly occupied with matters that left little room for dwelling on old grievances. She had, in the months following their marriage, begun quietly using a portion of her own independent income to support a small charitable initiative aimed at assisting women whose circumstances had left them without family support or social standing, an effort born directly from her own experience of near-total ruin following her broken engagement. The initiative began modestly, funding lodging and small stipends for women who found themselves, through no particular fault of their own, suddenly without the protection of family or fortune. Word of the effort spread slowly at first, then more quickly as several of the women she assisted found stable situations and spoke warmly of the support that had helped them through their most difficult months. Nathaniel took quiet pride in his wife's growing reputation for this work, often remarking that it reflected exactly the qualities that had first drawn his attention to her at that charity auction so many years before. The same steady compassion and refusal to look away from difficulty that had once impressed him watching her manage her own scandal with such composure. "You are building something considerably more meaningful than any business venture I have managed," he told her one evening, as they reviewed correspondence from a woman Eleanor's initiative had helped secure a respectable position within a merchant household several counties away. "I find I am prouder of this work than of anything I have accomplished on my own. It would not exist without the stability you gave me," Eleanor said. "I could not have built any of this from the position I found myself in that first morning after Edmund's betrayal. You gave me the ground to stand on. Everything since has simply been what I chose to build on that ground." He took her hand then, the same gesture he had offered her the night of his proposal, though it carried now the easy familiarity of 2 years of shared partnership rather than the careful uncertainty of new affection. "Then I am glad, more than I can properly express, that I chose to write that first letter after our conversation at the auction. I do not think either of us fully understood that evening exactly what we were beginning." Eleanor smiled, thinking back to the frightened, humiliated woman who had stood in that crowded hall, uncertain of anything except her own refusal to let scandal define the rest of her life. That woman could never have imagined the path that lay ahead of her, the marriage built on honesty rather than convenience, the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered beyond her own circumstances, the steady presence of a partner who valued her judgment as much as her company. "Nor did I," she agreed softly. "But I am considerably more grateful for where it led than I ever could have anticipated on that terrible morning." Outside the study window, the last light of evening settled gently over the grounds of Ashcombe House, the same grounds where she had once walked beneath the old elm tree while Nathaniel spoke, for the first time, of intentions he no longer wished to keep hidden. Eleanor sat quietly beside her husband, watching the light fade, and felt, as she often did in these peaceful evening hours, a deep and settled gratitude for everything her life had become, since the day it had seemed, so briefly, that everything worth having had been taken from her all at once. It had not been taken after all, she understood now. It had simply been cleared away to make room for something considerably better, built slowly and honestly, on ground that would not shift beneath her the way her old life once had, and held together not by convenient arrangement or family expectation, but by two people who had learned, through hardship and patience, exactly what it meant to choose each other, plainly and completely, without hesitation or hidden motive standing between them. The following spring brought further change to Ashcombe House when Eleanor learned she was carrying their first child. She told Nathaniel on a quiet morning much like any other, watching his usual composure give way, for one of the rare times she had witnessed, to open and unguarded joy. He held her carefully, as though she had suddenly become something far more fragile than the steady, capable woman he had married, and she laughed at his sudden carefulness, even as she pressed closer into his embrace, grateful beyond words for the family they were building together. Her father visited often in the months that followed, delighting in the prospect of a grandchild after fearing, during the darkest weeks following Edmund's betrayal, that his daughter's chance at a settled, happy life might never fully recover. He and Nathaniel had grown close in the years since the wedding, bonded by their shared devotion to Eleanor, and by a mutual respect for plain dealing that neither man had found easy to locate elsewhere in society. Watching them together, laughing over some small matter in the garden while she rested nearby, Eleanor often found herself marveling at how completely her family had been rebuilt from the scattered pieces left behind by that single terrible morning. The charitable initiative she had founded continued to grow as well, expanding beyond simple lodging assistance into a small network of women who had once received her help and now, in turn, offered guidance and support to others finding themselves in similarly difficult circumstances. Eleanor took particular satisfaction in watching this network take shape, understanding better than most how isolating those first weeks of scandal and uncertainty could feel, and how much a single steady hand of support could mean to a woman convinced that her entire future had been irreparably damaged. She thought sometimes, in her quieter moments, of writing down the full account of what had happened to her, not for publication or public consumption, but simply as a record for whatever children she and Nathaniel might raise together, a reminder that even the most devastating mornings did not have to determine the shape of everything that followed. She never quite found the time to begin such a project, occupied as she was with the growing demands of her household, her charitable work, and the child she now carried, but the intention remained with her, a quiet promise to eventually put into words the full journey from that shattered engagement to the settled, honest happiness she now enjoyed. For now it was enough simply to live it, day by steady day, beside a husband who had chosen her not out of convenience or family arrangement, but out of genuine and carefully considered regard, built patiently on a foundation of truth that neither of them had ever needed to question. Late one evening, as autumn settled once more over the grounds of Ashcombe House, Eleanor stood at the same window where she had once watched Nathaniel gaze out over his estate before their very first dinner together, back when their arrangement had been nothing more than a practical exchange between two cautious strangers. She placed a hand over the gentle curve of her stomach and looked out at the gardens below, golden and quiet in the fading light, and allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to feel the complete and settled happiness of a life rebuilt from ruin into something far steadier and far more honest than the one she had lost. Whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she faced them now from solid ground, certain of her own strength and certain, above all, of the man standing quietly beside her.